Have you ever wondered why we turn our clocks forward during the spring and backwards again during the fall? While daylight saving time is common in North America and Europe, many countries near the equator don't observe it and find this practice obscure and unusual. The story of daylight saving time starts with one of America's most famous inventors, Benjamin Franklin. In 1784, Franklin was serving as US ambassador to France when he humorously suggested that Parisians could save candles by getting up earlier to make better use of daylight. It wasn't until more than a century later, in 1907, that the concept of daylight saving time was seriously proposed by a British builder named William Willett. Willett noticed that people wasted valuable daylight by sleeping through it in the morning, especially during summer. He proposed moving clocks forward by 80 minutes in 4 20-minute increments each April and back again in September.
Everyone appreciates the long light evenings. Everyone laments their shrinkage as the days grow shorter. And nearly everyone has given utterance to a regret that the clear, bright light of early mornings during spring and summer months is so seldom seen or used.
Willett also pointed out the massive economic benefits of daylight savings.
Can any words be comprehensive enough to represent the cumulative effect of the 210 additional available hours of daylight, an average of 1 hour and 10 minutes every day for 6 months, which are within our reach to be had not only without price, but accompanied by a large saving in current expenditure year after year?
He calculated the figure at £2.5 million, which is £380 million today. Although Willett's idea gained some attention, it wasn't adopted during his lifetime, but soon an unexpected event would put his idea into action. As with most durable change, the introduction of daylight saving was a product of crisis and war. When World War I broke out in 1914, it quickly became one of the most resource-intensive conflicts the world had ever seen. The demand for resources, especially coal, which powered much of Europe's industry, homes, and the machinery fueling the war effort, was unprecedented. Energy conservation became a critical strategy, particularly for Germany, where coal shortages threatened to weaken their military and industrial strength. It was Germany and Austria-Hungary who first implemented daylight saving time as a national policy. On April 30th, 1916, the German Empire officially moved clocks forward by 1 hour. Their goal was to conserve fuel and resources by maximizing daylight and minimizing the need for artificial lighting. As reported by German papers at the time,
the Ministry of the Interior has decided to adopt Sommerzeit, or summertime, in the hope of saving fuel resources. Citizens are encouraged to make full use of the natural light to contribute to the war effort.
Germany's plan was simple but effective. By shifting the clocks forward, they extended the amount of usable daylight into the evening hours, reducing the need to burn coal for lighting. This extra daylight would ease the strain on coal reserves, which were essential not only for keeping homes warm, but also for producing the steel and munitions critical to the war. Seeing the potential benefits, Britain quickly followed suit. An editorial in the London Times from May 1916 remarked,
"If Germany has seen fit to conserve its resources by adopting summertime, it behooves us to consider the same. This war demands sacrifices from all, and what simpler sacrifice than to adjust our clocks and make use of our natural daylight?"
Soon, Britain and France adopted daylight saving time, and other Allied nations followed. Even though they were locked in fierce battles across Europe, they were united in the need to conserve resources back home. Daylight saving time was becoming standard across Europe. The United States joined the fray in 1918 when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Standard Time Act, making daylight saving time official nationwide. President Wilson promoted it as a patriotic act, encouraging all Americans to conserve energy in support of the Allied forces.
This is an hour, not merely of conservation, but of cooperation. Let us each make use of every hour of daylight for the sake of our sons and brothers overseas who fight for liberty.
But not everyone in the United States was enthusiastic about daylight saving time. Farmers, in particular, found the shift disruptive to their schedules. A quote from the New York Times in October 1918 captures this sentiment.
For the farmer who wakes with the sun, daylight saving time means nothing but confusion. Cows cannot tell the difference between 5 and 6 o'clock, and the markets operate by sunlight, not by clocks.
In the United States, this rural-urban divide would continue to shape opinions on daylight saving time in the years that followed. Despite its popularity in cities, the practice was repealed in the US after the war ended in 1918, as many argued that it disrupted daily life more than it conserved energy. In Europe, however, the experience of World War I cemented daylight saving time as a valuable measure. Many countries kept the practice in place even after the war, believing it to be useful for balancing resources and maximizing productivity during daylight hours. World War II reignited the need for daylight saving time. This time, modern weaponry took center stage, and the need for fuel and resource conservation was even greater. As countries prepared for an intense global conflict, saving energy became a top priority. On February 9, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an order implementing year-round daylight saving time across the United States.
The time has come when we must all make sacrifices, big and small, in the name of our country. Every drop of fuel saved, every light turned off, brings us closer to victory.
Officially called wartime, this move was designed to help the country conserve fuel and electricity during the war effort. Roosevelt's order extended daylight saving time throughout the year, meaning that Americans wouldn't move their clocks back in the winter. This way, the country could take full advantage of every hour of daylight. In American factories and shipyards, where round-the-clock production was essential, wartime allowed workers to maximize daylight hours and reduce the need for artificial lighting. The hope was that this extra daylight would also reduce civilian energy use at home, helping to reserve fuel for the military. Although wartime was largely embraced by the nation, some Americans voiced frustration. Just as during World War I, farmers felt the strain. While urban factories thrived, farmers, who relied on natural sunlight rather than clock time, found it disruptive to their routines and markets.
In the city, an extra hour may mean saving fuel. On the farm, it means hours of confusion and a disruption to a rhythm we cannot afford to lose.
America wasn't alone in adopting year-round DST. Across the Atlantic, countries in Europe also implemented full-time daylight saving. Britain, for example, took an even more extreme approach, implementing what was known as double British summertime. Clocks were moved forward by 2 hours in the summer, allowing people to stay productive far into the evening. As with every great British moment during World War II, here is a quote from Winston Churchill.
"We must squeeze every drop of daylight from the skies. Let the enemy know that the British spirit will not dim, no matter the hour."
For people in Britain, double DST meant they were waking up, working and socializing in hours much later than usual. British diaries and letters from the time reveal that the long evening hours were a strange but welcome change, giving people precious extra time to grow victory gardens or volunteer for the Home Guard. During the Blitz, daylight saving time took on another significance. Longer daylight hours meant that people could finish work and make their way home before blackout orders went into effect in the evening. Air raid shelters filled in the early evening, where families gathered for safety during the bombings. As the days stretched longer, people could even work on home defense efforts and bond with neighbors in the shelter of daylight.
The long days are both a blessing and a curse. We have more time to tend to our gardens and children, but with the long light comes the waiting. I am grateful for the extra daylight, yet I long for a time when this is summertime is simply that. Summer and nothing else.
Meanwhile, in German-occupied Europe, the Nazis enforced daylight saving time across the territories they controlled. By coordinating clocks in occupied countries, Germany could simplify its own wartime logistics. However, this mandate created resentment among citizens in occupied areas who saw the enforced time change as yet another way that the Nazis were controlling their lives.
Even our hours belong to the Reich. Every tick of the clock marks not only time but the loss of our autonomy.
To many, daylight saving time became the symbol of a foreign occupation and control over even the smallest details of daily life. By the end of World War II, daylight saving time had become entrenched as a wartime measure that stretched across borders. Both Allied and Axis nations saw this as a way to maximize productivity, conserve resources, and support their military strategies. When the war finally ended in 1945, the US repealed wartime, allowing states to decide for themselves whether to continue with DST. Many states reverted to standard time, while others, especially those with large cities, held on to DST, leading to a confusing patchwork of time zones and changes. As the New York Times reported, for the average commuter, DST might mean leaving work at 5 p.m., but arriving home to find it's only 4:45 in the next county. Transportation was one of the biggest headaches. Airlines and railroads had to juggle dozens of time changes along their routes. In one famously confusing example, passengers on a 35-mile bus ride from Steubenville, Ohio to Moundsville, West Virginia had to set their watches back and forth 7 times because each city had its own rules for DST. This inconsistency wasn't just frustrating, it cost businesses money. Airlines and TV stations had to print different schedules for different cities, and it made planning nearly impossible. A public official in Iowa, where towns could each set their own DST rules, summed up the confusion perfectly. If you were to drive through Iowa on a Sunday afternoon, you could pass through 6 different time zones within 35 miles. By the 1960s, it was clear that something had to change. Lawmakers began pushing for a national standard to end the time chaos once and for all. Finally, in 1966, Congress passed the Uniform Time Act. This law established a standardized schedule for DST across the country, so that everyone would start and end DST on the same dates. States were still allowed to opt out, and Arizona and Hawaii still opt out from DST today. The Uniform Time Act brought much-needed consistency and helped unify timekeeping practices across the country. A Chicago Tribune editorial praised the move, saying, "At last we can all tell time in the same way." The era of confusing time zones was finally over, at least for the most part. In the early 1970s, the United States faced a major energy crisis. In 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the US and other Western nations, leading to severe fuel shortages and skyrocketing gas prices. Americans saw lines at gas stations stretching for blocks, and many stations ran out of fuel entirely. This was a wake-up call. America needed to save energy any way it could. To tackle the crisis, President Richard Nixon and Congress took several measures to conserve energy. One of the ideas they dusted off was daylight saving time. In 1974, Congress passed the Emergency Daylight Saving Time Energy Conservation Act, putting the US on year-round DST for the first time in history.
This winter, I'm asking all Americans to turn down their thermostats, avoid unnecessary driving, and yes, adjust our clocks to make the most of the daylight.
The hope was that this extra daylight would reduce overall energy consumption by 1%, a small amount, but significant given the crisis. However, year-round DST didn't go as smoothly as planned. While adults adjusted to the change, the early dark winter mornings became a problem, especially for children. Many parents were uncomfortable sending their kids to school in pitch-black darkness. A 1974 New York Times article described the scene across the country. Children walked to their bus stops under streetlights, and families worried for their safety as they set out into the pre-dawn hours. In response, some schools delayed their start times, while others encouraged students to wear reflective clothing or carry flashlights. But parents were concerned, and soon public opinion began to shift against year-round DST. One parent in Boston wrote to her local newspaper saying,
"It's hard to explain to my 6-year-old why she has to wait in the dark for her school bus. I understand the need to save energy, but this feels like a sacrifice too far."
The concerns over safety and public discomfort led Congress to revisit the experiment. By late 1975, lawmakers decided to end year-round DST, returning to the regular DST schedule. When the clocks returned to standard time that fall, many Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The year-long experiment had shown that while DST could save a small amount of energy, the costs to daily life, especially for families, were high. An editorial in the Washington Post summed up the public's feelings. Energy savings must be balanced with the rhythm of daily life. America has spoken, and it prefers the daylight of morning over the illusion of energy saved. The energy crisis of the 1970s showed that daylight saving time could have real impacts. both positive and negative. Though the year-round DST experiment didn't stick, the idea of using DST to conserve energy would continue to shape our timekeeping practices. In 2007, the United States extended DST under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Other countries have similar systems, but the dates often differ. Over the years, daylight saving time has become increasingly controversial. Studies show that the energy savings may be minimal, and some even suggest that the biannual time change impacts our health by disrupting sleep patterns and increasing stress levels. In recent years, several US states and European countries have debated whether to keep daylight saving time, adopt permanent DST, or abolish the time change altogether. As we move forward, the debate over DST continues. Will we someday say goodbye to clock changes for good, or will the tradition persist as it has for over a century? But one thing's for sure. The next time you change your clock, remember, you're taking part in a debate that's been going on for over a century.